I'm Dr. Duke with The New American, and this is my take on the news. And I'm joined today by Daniel Natal, a teacher of business ethics, a thinker, a reader, a really articulate responder. And so, Daniel, I want to thank you for joining me again today.
Thanks, Duke, for having me.
Well, I think this is going to be a really interesting topic. We've talked about it a lot, I know. It's been written about a lot. It's this idea that the American school system, from kindergarten all the way through the universities, the graduate programs, the law schools, we really kind of shifted as something's happened that people weren't watching. We went from a system in my lifetime that was primarily based on mastery of subject matter. Become the best at math as you can, become a better writer, learn science more and more advanced, right? The model of the schools was to promote that kind of mastery and credentialing. And somewhere between now and the 1960s and now, that's really been fundamentally transformed to a system where we are conditioning students, not teaching them, where we are, for lack of a better word, indoctrinating them, not turning them into critical thinkers capable of thinking and doing for themselves. Talk a little bit about that as you understand it. Where did this idea come from? Is it a socialist idea primarily, or is it something bigger than that?
Well, if you go back to classical education pedagogy, Cicero in De Republica, he talks about the origins of the term liberal education, and he says that it comes from the word liber, which means a free man. And so a liberal education was originally the education of a free man. And he said the education of a free man consists of teaching him how to think, whereas the education of a slave consists of teaching him what to think. And so, as we're looking now at methodologies of in training children, essentially, they're not being taught how to think, but they're being given a raft of particular dogmatic points. Global warming is one, or America is illegitimate and a racist is another, and they're given catchphrases and stuff like that to repeat back that they don't ever really examine critically because they're not designed to be examined critically. And you started seeing this emphasis on teaching people what to think rather than how to think. Basically, early on in the 20th century, you got John Dewey as an example was a big socialist, and he wanted to train young people to be prepared for the new collectivist society to come. And he believed that the individualist society that America had been based on was a thing of the past, that republics were a thing of the past, and he wanted to condition them. I was just reading a book by Bella Dodd, and she was an educator and a communist. She eventually, after 30 years, kind of renounced it. But she talks very explicitly in extraordinary detail about how, as a communist, she infiltrated the New York school system and how she was placing different communists all throughout the hierarchy and doing it for social justice and all these interesting things that are very pertinent today. I mean, she uses the same methodology. She talks about goon squads being used to intimidate like people who aren't going along with the new collectivist society. So, I mean, the students are really being trained to be conformists.
A lot of globalism, a lot of one world, new order business here, right? The idea that speaking of education, Common Core tells you one of the rare instances where a federal program is actually named what it is, Common Core. We're not going to give your kids an outstanding education. We're not going to give them an education that allows them to be all that they're capable of being or to be the better individuals that as God made them. We're going to give you a common education, which means an education that everybody gets the same. And by that, you have to lower standards, not raise them. Every time you raise standards, somebody drops off the bandwagon, right? But the lower you make the standards, the more, there's that word again, inclusive everything is. And I think you're exactly right. These buzzwords, I mean, they have an almost hypnotic power over a lot of you, particularly young people. I'm a university professor myself. I see it too. It takes me an entire semester to break them of this. I put the word liberal and conservative on the blackboard the first day of class, and I asked them, and I point to the word conservative. I said, have you ever heard in any of your classes or from any of your teachers a positive example of conservatism? Nobody raises their hands. I then say liberal. Have you ever heard the word liberal critiqued, ever used in a negative connotation? Never. I've been doing this for years. Not one time has anybody ever said they've heard conservative used as a positive and liberal as a negative. And these are talking 18-year-old freshmen in college. And so it takes me about a whole semester to break them of that kind of thinking, assuming they stay. Some of the more deeply programmed, they'll just drop the class because it's short circuit. Like you said, it makes them neurotic a little bit, right? Giving them contradictory information kind of short changes their brains a little bit. In fact, talk a little bit about that aspect. You mentioned before we went on the air, Pavlov and some of the early experiments with this, and even the experiments with some early computing. Talk a little bit about that with relation to the human experience.
Yeah. Well, basically, just going back to John Dewey to the 1920s and 30s, there was a lot of experimentation with behavioral psychology. How do people learn? And so Pavlov, of course, did his famous experiments on dogs. And just as a side consequence, a side effect, he discovered that if you give dogs contradictory instructions, that the dog will get confused. The dog will run around in circles. The dog doesn't know what to do. And so they refer to this as behavioral disorganization, the ability to trigger in an animal synthetic neurosis, synthetic insanity. And two of his assistants, Vygotsky and Luria, were very interested in this. Whereas Pavlov moved on to other things, they specialized in how to induce behavioral disorganization, as they called it, by giving contradictory instructions. And so as I was discussing, when you look at modern kind of left wing teaching, socialist teaching, which is funny because these people were in the Soviet Union, or yeah, right after the Soviet Union was the collapse. But the modern school system was shaped by Vygotsky, who was flown in the 1930s to the United States and invited to contribute to the re-engineering of the United States educational system. And he said that children shouldn't be educated; they should be trained like animals. And so one of those things that you do is behavioral disorganization, where you flood children with contradictory messaging. As I gave it the example before, they'll tell children races don't exist, but white people are evil, or they'll tell people that a man can't have an opinion on abortion because he doesn't know what it's like to be a woman, but then they'll say men can be women. And as I was alluding to before, you see this kind of behavioral disorganization all throughout academia, all throughout media. In which case, currently we're seeing it with COVID, with the contradictory messaging of alone together or new normal. And this is a way to break down somebody's critical thinking faculty, somebody's very ability to process things rationally. And this was also just going back to a book called The Cybernetic Brain, where they talk about the history of computing and AI and stuff. And so they discovered too in the 1940s, Gray Maynard, that you could actually drive machines insane by also giving them contradictory messaging, contradictory instructions. So you see this in a very cynical way, kind of rolled out across not just young students who are very vulnerable because they don't have critical thinking faculties developed yet, but across the culture. I mean, across mass media, marketing, very very sophisticated techniques.
Yeah, one of the most horrifying aspects of this for me as a teacher is 25 years ago, I saw it in my college kids, but it was mostly something they were getting at college. Early 1990s, kids came to school. They were pretty ignorant, but they weren't necessarily overtly politicized. They didn't know much, but they didn't have strong political opinions either way. 25 years later, what I find is that they come to school even less knowledgeable, and that ignorance, which initially bred a kind of humility in the 1990s, they knew they didn't know things and they felt bad about it. That has been completely replaced now by even a greater level of ignorance and just a shocking political arrogance. They don't have to know what the founding fathers said to know they're racist. They don't need to study American history to know that it's racist. In fact, it's almost become considered a mark of political correctness not to have read the great slave-holding Western culture, right? So they've turned ignorance into a virtue. At younger and younger ages now, one of the things Common Core did was put that kind of garbage in elementary schools. Tell us, how does that mess with the mind of a 5, 6, 7-year-old when you're telling them, a 5-year-old, hey, you may not be the gender you are? What kind of havoc does that wreak with little kids?
Well, there are news stories right now with the COVID-19 shutdown, how a lot of kids are being homeschooled or going home. And a lot of these kids are actually reversing their transitions, which kind of like indicates to you that, the indoctrination centers that public schools are. There was recently, too, this week, a teacher came out and he was afraid of having kind of live lessons over computers because parents might be able to see the indoctrination. And he actually uses a term very similar to behavioral disorganization. He talks about the disruption of the children's ideas of race and sexuality. The disruption. This is very similar to, if you look at their other euphemisms, things like deconstructing white supremacy. Of course, deconstructing be a euphemism for destroy. And so, yeah, I mean, they're very kind of. I was talking to a college professor just by the by just recently, and she said she didn't know that I was conservative, and she said that she was terrified of the live lessons. She said because conservative parents might see what they're telling the children, and to her that you could tell that she was very threatened. You can tell the power that parents have when they actually reach out to their representatives, or they reach out to the school district, people of executive position and stuff like that. So
shows where we are as a culture, where they have no problem miseducating your kids. Their only problem is that you might find out as a mom and dad. That scares the bejesus out of them. Daniel Natal, thank you again for your time today. We appreciate it.